Neville Goddard described what he called the feeling that never fails as the inner condition in which a conclusion is no longer treated as possible or hoped for, but is already established. In his framework, this feeling is not an emotion, and not a surge of confidence. It is the cognitive state in which the mind experiences a situation as complete. The phrase does not point to excitement or belief in the usual sense. It points to a settled inner position in which an outcome is no longer mentally pending. You are asked to notice the difference between reacting emotionally to an idea and experiencing it as already resolved. In the first case, the mind remains in motion, testing and comparing. In the second, it becomes still. For Neville, this stillness is the sign that the assumption has been accepted as real. The unresolved tension at the center of this claim is whether such inner finality can remain stable when external conditions have not yet shifted. The model rests on an assumption that reverses the ordinary order of explanation. Neville treats consciousness as primary and circumstances as secondary. He does not argue that events create certainty, but that certainty organizes how events are encountered. In this view, experience follows the state of awareness rather than producing it. You normally wait for confirmation before allowing yourself to feel that something is settled. In Neville's framework, that sequence is inverted. Feeling is taken as the internal registration of reality before the senses report it. The mind is assumed to be capable of occupying a state prior to its appearance in observable form. The open question that follows is whether inner knowing can be psychologically legitimate without being anchored to evidence. When Neville speaks of feeling, he does not mean mood, enthusiasm, or emotional tone. He refers to the degree of reality a thought carries in consciousness. A thought can be entertained, considered, or believed, and still remain provisional. Feeling, in his sense, arises when the mind no longer treats the thought as a hypothesis. It is the point at which an idea is no longer evaluated but accepted. You can notice this difference in your own cognition. Some conclusions remain open, continually reviewed. Others are closed and no longer require attention. Neville defines feeling as this closure. It is the sense that a matter is no longer under discussion. The tension is whether such closure can occur in the absence of sensory support. From this perspective, the never-failing quality of the feeling refers to its function, not to a guarantee of outcomes. A fulfilled feeling is the psychological state in which alternatives have been dropped. When that state is reached, attention ceases to oscillate between conflicting possibilities. The mind is no longer divided between having and not having. It rests in one position. This is what Neville calls psychological completion. You are invited to observe how unresolved questions continue to draw mental energy, while resolved ones do not. The unresolved issue is whether a conclusion can remain closed when the environment still presents contradictory signals. Imagination, in Neville's system, is the faculty through which such closure is formed. He does not treat imagination as speculation, but as the mode in which the mind experiences states as present. When an imagined situation is merely considered, it remains optional. When it is lived inwardly as actual, it acquires the quality of fact. Feeling is the sign that this transition has occurred. The imagined state is no longer labeled as future or conditional. It is accepted as current. The question that remains open is whether an internally experienced state can be granted the same cognitive authority as one registered by the senses. Within this structure, the internal logic becomes clear. If consciousness organizes experience, then the state of fulfillment must come before its external expression. Doubt reopens the conclusion and reintroduces mental division. Conviction stabilizes it. The sequence is consistent. Assumption leads, perception follows. You can examine how expectations shape interpretation in ordinary life. Once a conclusion is fixed, evidence is read in its light. Neville extends this principle to all experience. The unresolved tension is whether internal coherence implies actual causal priority or only psychological consistency. This inner first ordering is not unique to Neville. Across philosophical traditions, there's a recurring emphasis on inner assent proceeding out of confirmation. Systems of thought that focus on certainty, conviction, or acceptance often locate the decisive act within consciousness itself. Neville's contribution is to recast this structure in psychological terms, removing overt theological framing and presenting it as a law of mental organization. You are asked to recognize a pattern rather than to adopt a doctrine. The open question is why such inner first models persist historically if external proof were always the primary source of certainty. Mental discipline, in Neville's framework, concerns the stabilization of the assumed state. Once the feeling of fulfillment is reached, the task is not to intensify it, but to refrain from reopening the question. The impulse to check, to look for signs, or to reassess reintroduces uncertainty. Repetition, in this context, does not serve to convince, but to maintain identity. You can notice how frequently the mind returns to unresolved matters, and how resolved matters require no such return. The tension lies in how long certainty can be sustained without feedback from the environment. When the feeling of fulfillment is established, perception reorganizes. Experience is filtered through the settled assumption. Information that aligns with it is registered as relevant, while information that contradicts it loses centrality. This is not described as distortion, but as coherence. The mind interprets from the standpoint it occupies. You are invited to observe how conclusions shape what is noticed and what is ignored. The unresolved issue is whether perception is merely selective within a fixed world or whether it participates in structuring what is experienced. Agency, in Neville's model, is located in the selection of inner state. To choose is not primarily to act upon circumstances, but to occupy a position of consciousness. Responsibility is defined as maintaining that position. Action, in the ordinary sense, becomes secondary. The primary act is psychological alignment. You can reflect on how your sense of authorship is tied to the positions you hold as settled. The tension that remains is whether such inner positioning alone justifies the experience of being a cause rather than merely an interpreter. Holding conviction without immediate confirmation has psychological costs. The fulfilled feeling removes oscillation, but it also removes the reassurance that comes from continual checking. The mind must tolerate a period in which its conclusion stands alone. This exposes it to doubt, not as an argument, but as an absence of reinforcement. Neville treats this interval as structurally necessary within his model. The open question is how long certainty can persist in silence before it dissolves or reopens in the final analysis. The feeling that never fails names a specific configuration of consciousness. It is the state in which a conclusion is internally complete, attention is unified, and alternatives are no longer entertained. It reveals how, in Neville Goddard's framework, imagination generates conviction. Conviction stabilizes identity, and identity organizes perception. The structure can be understood without being endorsed. What remains is a clear view of how the mind can arrange experience around inner finality, and how certainty, weighting, and causation are ordered within that arrangement.